Hello everyone, it's Silver. This is Flowstone Saga. So this is a JRPG, but it's using a pretty unique puzzle battle system. And you might be looking at it and thinking, so kind of like Tetris, right? Well, it's not really like that much at all. It has a lot of differences from that game, and in fact, you can't really even advertise a game to say it's like Tetris or Tetris inspired, because the company that owns Tetris is extremely litigious and will sue the crap out of you if you even mention the name of their game. But in this case, this is much more like something like Super Puzzle Fighter, or even a little bit of like Luminous in there as well. And one thing I should probably mention from the beginning is the pacing of the game. What you're going to be seeing in the footage is sort of turn-based looking, where the piece stays at the top of the screen and I drop it down and things sort of go one turn at a time. But this is only an optional mode. The way that the game works by default is more like a puzzle-style game where the blocks drop in real time and everything happens in sequence. It's not turn-based. I just personally don't do well when it comes to puzzle games with time limits. I like to take my time and think about things. And so I switched to the mode that lets me play it more as a turn-based sort of game, but just so you know, that's actually not the default, and instead it's usually the sort of real-time blocks falling and you can't slow them down kind of experience. So you play as someone named Mirai, and you're on this island where people are just sort of eking out a living, and there are all these mysterious ruins all over the place. And while exploring the ruins, you find this interesting artifact that lets you use this puzzle combat system as sort of a magic power that no one else has, and you start to use it to solve pretty much all of your problems, which means most of the mechanics in this game revolve around this block-based puzzle system. Everything from battling critters to opening doors to rebuilding old structures, all that stuff, it uses this system in some way. And the game also has kind of a specific structure to how it operates. Basically, because you're on this island and things aren't going so well for the village that you're in, the very small village of just a few people, after receiving these powers, you will be getting requests from the villagers to build various structures, and then they'll need some materials as well as a key item of some kind that a boss drops. So basically the game loop is you get a request from a villager, you find where the boss is and go and battle through sort of a dungeon area and get to the boss and get the items and materials you need, and then you go back and build that structure for them and you move on to the next one. But while all this is happening, you also have an actual story underneath. You have the mystery of these ruins and where this power came from, as well as new ruins that allow you to expand the power with new elemental capabilities and things, as well as a storyline involving recruiting new people for your village and some pirates that have taken up residence on the island and are causing trouble, and how to deal with them. So without spoiling anything about how the story goes, I do like how it's presented because it's sort of a multi-part story, right? You've got the pirate part, and you've got the village construction part, and you've got the ancient ruin delving for new powers part, and they all kind of inform each other as you go through and unlock more areas to explore. Sometimes, whenever you need to build a new structure or solve an ancient puzzle, you will be presented with a sort of puzzle board that has a shape silhouetted on it, and then you'll be presented with a number of pieces that you have to drop in a specific order. You can't change the order, but you can rotate them. And you've got to drop them in such a way that they make whatever shape is silhouetted on the screen, and that's sort of the main puzzle part of the game, the non-combat puzzles. And some of these shapes are really straightforward and easy to make, others are much more complicated, and some actually involve specific timing where you have to drop a piece down a certain amount of the way down the screen and then sort of shuffle it off to the side at just the right time to get into a specific place you couldn't otherwise get because of the order that you have to drop them. So some of them do get pretty complicated. A lot of these are for progression, where you need them to open doors or construct new important buildings and things, but you will also sometimes find these little altar thingies that are just puzzles for puzzle's sake. They don't actually unlock anything, but instead they give you this material called flow essence, which you'll need to upgrade your frogs, which is a sentence that'll make more sense in a minute. And the main section of the game is actually the combat, because as you're exploring, you'll come across lots of enemies. There are no random encounters in this game. All enemies are on the field, and battle starts as soon as you run into them. So in battle, you will have a large board of pieces that will constantly be dropping from the top, and you gotta fit them together and match lines. And every time you match a full line, it'll disappear and you will do an attack. And depending on the number of lines matched at once, it'll change the strength of the attack. So playing really efficiently and cascading lots of matches down the screen all at once is a good strategy for dealing huge amounts of damage, but it's also a little bit more complicated than that because there are other mechanics that you've got to be aware of during combat that mean it's not always about matching as often as possible. Sometimes you actually want some inefficient placement and some other weirdness depending on what sort of class you're playing. And this is where the frogs come in. So you can, at any time back at your safe hub area, you can speak to some frogs. Just walk up and poke them. They're these weird little ghostly frogs. They're very cute. And they will give you a new class. And you will unlock more of these little guys as you go through the story. And you can only have one of them active at a time, but it will determine several things. For one, it'll determine the size of the board that you use in combat. Some of them are really wide, and some of them are a lot more narrow. Like the Demolitionist, for instance, is only 8 blocks wide, so it's way smaller than your usual board is. But there's a reason for that, because all of these classes also have a different selection of block shapes that will appear, as well as different passive effects that kind of determine how you're intended to play that class. Like, so the Demolitionist, since I mentioned that earlier, it has a passive that makes it to where the taller of a tower you build without matching it, the more damage you do. So you're actually intended not to match very frequently with the Demolitionist and instead build really tall and risky towards the top of the screen. If you build completely to the top of the screen and run out of room, then it's an immediate game over and you've got to restart the battle. So it's a risky class to play, but it also drops TNT blocks all around the place as you're building, and these will detonate and clear out more of the screen than you normally could with simple matches. So it's a class that's all about playing tall and risky, and all of the pieces that it gets are related to this because it uses a very narrow board. Its pieces tend to be long and tall. But there's also a lot of other different classes that you can play that all have their own different play styles and piece styles and all that stuff, which is pretty cool. I think this is probably the best way you could do a very puzzle-heavy combat system like this, is to give the player a lot of freedom in terms of how exactly they want to engage with it. And in fact, you can even choose to go freelancer, which means no class, basically. You don't poke any frogs. And as a freelancer, you actually don't get any of the bonuses, the passive effects of the other classes, but in exchange for that, you get all of the pieces at once. So you can have a really flexible board filled with all kinds of different pieces depending on what you want to select. You've also got 2 active skill slots. These are like spells, kind of, and you will gather mana in different ways, mostly by matching and defeating enemies and things. And you can spend this mana on the spells, and they do everything from summoning a straight piece to help you get matches more easily, or there are various elemental powers you can get, so you can set the whole board on fire and cause damage over time to your enemies, and some things like that. There are several of them, and also as you level up the frogs, by feeding them food from your crops, as well as that flow essence, you will get new spells from them as well relevant to that class. Like the Demolitionist gets a spell that allows you to detonate all TNT blocks on the board all at once. The enemies you're fighting are also pretty important because oftentimes enemies will charge their attacks, and you can actually hit them with enough matches while they're charging in order to interrupt them and prevent them from doing something really nasty. So at certain times there may be a case where you don't want to build tall anymore no matter what class you're playing because an enemy is about to do something really big and damaging, and you want to just hit them as many times as possible to knock them out of it. A lot of your enemies also will have some attacks that can destroy parts of the board. When they're charging one of these, the bits of the board that'll be destroyed will light up in sort of an orange silhouette to show you what pieces are going to break, and you know to try to work around that if you can, or stay away from them or something, because all of that's about to crumble. I like this mechanic because it makes the fights more interesting. It gives certain enemies much more dangerous techniques that you've got to watch out for because they can actually destroy parts of your tower. But at the same time, I have to admit, the big orange glowy silhouettes that show up on the screen are really distracting and kind of block off your vision of the board and make it hard to see what spaces are empty sometimes. There's also the heat mechanic. You'll probably be noticing that some pieces have little yellow diamond shapes in them, and if you get at least 3 of those diamond shapes touching, then you'll collect them all and gain heat, which is like a sort of building power resource. The more heat you gain, you get the sort of battle aura, and you get stronger and stronger. So as you go up in tiers of heat, your attacks will get more and more powerful. This is a necessary mechanic for more difficult enemies and boss fights and things, because it's the only way you're going to deal enough damage to them quickly enough to actually take them down before they take you down. But the interesting thing about the heat crystals is the way that they're often placed in pieces means that placing pieces to match heat crystals and placing pieces to match actual rows are often two different things. So sometimes you have to build deliberately and efficiently in order to gather a bunch of heat first, because if you just match a row where a bunch of crystals are, it doesn't collect them automatically, it'll simply match the row and they'll disappear. So you need to collect the crystals as a separate action and then match things after that. And there are also several other kinds of pieces that could potentially fall on the board that are dependent on different status effects and attacks that enemies can do. They may summon ice or overgrow vines on certain pieces, or summon fiery blocks or bombs. There are all sorts of different pieces that you've got to worry about, and as you go through the game and you get deeper into the harder dungeons and things, you'll start finding more advanced enemies that have more stuff that you need to consider while fighting them. You've also got the flask, which is an interesting mechanic. You have a flask with a couple of charges, and these charges will refill after battle. And whenever you use the flask, it'll plop down whatever you put in the flask on the board. And then once you match wherever that goes, then you will get its effect. So the basic one you get at first is cheese, and you can match the cheese block to heal yourself. So you can use it as a healing flask, but you have to actually plop the cheese down somewhere on the board and then match whatever row it gets put in order to get its effect. And as you go through the game, you'll get more and more different things that you could put in this flask, from different types of like attack buffs or defense buffs, even stuff that clears off status effects or heals in different amounts and things. So there's quite a bit to do. And also at certain points in the story, you will expand the flask with the ability to fit more than one ingredient in it. So you can actually have several things in it at once, which is really handy. I really like this combat system. I think it's a lot of fun, and it's really well made with the neat tile variants and things like that due to the different classes you can be. But I do have two criticisms of it. I think one is that only 2 spell slots is kind of restricting, because there are a lot of abilities in this game, and having only 2 of them be equipable at a time kind of sucks. I wish there was more than that, 3 or 4, especially because the various elemental powers that you get at certain story thresholds also take one of those 2 slots. If there was a way to activate those elemental powers separately from your spells, I think having only 2 spell slots would probably be okay, but the fact that they have to share with your other spells kind of sucks. And the only other criticism I really have is that it does really slow the pace down a lot. And this isn't just because I'm playing in the more turn-based mode. It's just because, you know, one of the criticisms that people level at JRPGs is the whole going into turn-based battle land and defeating an enemy and then going back to exploration a bunch of times in a row can really slow the pacing down, especially in areas that you've already been with really weak enemies. And that goes doubly here because even small, weak battles take a little bit of extra time, since you got to do all this matching stuff. So there's no quick way to get through weak enemies. You still have to do all these matching battles, and it does mean that the pace of the game is much slower as a result of the battles taking longer. I don't necessarily think this is an objectively bad thing. I just think that it depends on how much of a tolerance you have for the slower pace of JRPG battles. Overall, I really like Flowstone Saga. I think it's a pretty interesting game with a pretty inventive battle system and a lot of fun to be had. It's also relatively long. It'll probably take you about 20 to 25 hours to complete, which is, for an indie JRPG, that's quite a long game. The only other thing I will say is that it's a bit crash heavy sometimes. I haven't been able to figure out why, but this game does like to crash during boss fights, which is about the worst possible time to crash. I've had it happen several times, to the point that I'm actually having trouble progressing past the Captain Krim boss fight, because every time I get to the second phase of the fight, it crashes. So there's definitely something that needs to be fixed in terms of its overall stability. I think the game might need a patch or two to get some of these issues under control, because it definitely does seem to be a bit crash happy. But aside from that, I do think it is a really solid game, and I have no problems recommending it to people, especially because it seems like these crashes only happen to a few select individuals, and a lot of people don't experience them. So whatever the crashing problem is apparently not super widespread. So yeah, I'll link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Flowstone Saga if you guys wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.